Okay, and today's webinar is about mirroring as a mean to build up your thesis. And we hope that you will get through that webinar a better understanding on how mirroring as a technique can support you in your research and developing your thesis and narrative. And well, first of all, we want you to understand what is mirroring about. It's nothing that we invented ourselves, but it's actually a century-old technique. And if you see music today a lot, it's not innocent because it's applied in the area of music a lot, but also in other scientific areas, as we will see in the third part of the webinar. Now, mirroring is a gradual process, and we will spend a great deal of time today in the second part of the webinar to look into how the thesis and the research progresses over time and how using mirroring over time then can help you to work out the structure and narrative of your thesis and the research as such. And then exactly we look into mirroring as being a century-old concept in the third part. And in the fourth, we will again look into examples on what could be mirrored through the thesis. So today's webinar will be very hands-on and driven by examples. And in closing then off the record, you will have the chance to reflect on what you found so far challenging in your thesis composition and what you have attempted for doing to assure that there's a consistent information flow and narrative. Now, let's start with what mirroring is about. It's a systematic approach, first of all, to see how the different parts of the thesis relate to each other. And it can be used as a tool that helps you building up consistency across the thesis and therefore also through your research project. And you can use it as an analytical framework and also to support boundary building. So to understand what is within the boundaries of your research and what is out. And ideally, it will provide you with a mean to communicate, to illustrate your work to others so that they can better grasp and understand what it is about. And in a nutshell, we will then look into how mirroring is used in music and opera and what could be learned from that. Now, if we use mirroring, then we have the opportunity to engage in a systematic comparison of the different parts of the thesis and to understand how they relate to each other. And this will allow us to detect inconsistencies, but also redundancies in the work. And ultimately, if you apply it as an analytical framework, it allows you to evaluate the maturity either of your own work or the work of others. And now let's look into this image and what it does provide us with. Now, on the one hand, you see repetitions and things that are reused through the different chapters of the thesis. Now, this is a standard thesis structure, I would argue, which is chapter 1 introduction, chapter 2 literature review, the chapter 3 with the methodology, chapter 4 with the findings, 5 the analysis, and the 6 the conclusion. Now, if you look into that, you will see some images from music, like the notes or the guitar, the drums, and you see how they are popping up across the chapters. That means there's a consistent discussion about notes in the introduction once it's 111, and that is also mirrored over in the literature review, where in 2.3 you again talk about notes, and in the methods you go back from a methodological perspective, you look back into notes, and then you see that the notes again come up in the analysis and in the conclusion. But you also will detect that there are no notes in the findings. It means in your data collection, notes alone didn't come out, but as part of the melody, in 4.3, they have been covered. So this is a high-level reading through your thesis. And once you get to that point, you will, for yourself, have the clarity about what is in your thesis, but also how to communicate it to others. Now, looking into this, can you spot the apparent inconsistency in this table of content? Let's give it a look. Is there anyone detecting any inconsistency? And I know Enoch already participated in that webinar a while ago, and he spotted it back then right away. So let's look into that. Right, you see that the trumpet is missing in 2. Now, why is the trumpet missing in 2? Now, you collect data in 4, and the findings show in 4.4 a strong component related to the trumpet, and your analysis in 5.4 goes and compares the role of trumpets within the melody. And in the conclusion, 6.1.1, no, wait, 6.2, the trumpet again comes out strongly in the same relation as in 5.4 in the context of the melody. So you see that in between 4.3, 4.4, 5.4, and 6.2, you have a clear relation. And you also see that the melody has been covered in 1.1.2. Now, what has not been covered, however, is the trumpet. You have other music instruments that are covered in 2.3.1, 2.3.2, 2.3.3, but none of which is a trumpet. Now, what does it mean? It means that the trumpet perhaps was a surprising finding, and therefore it was deliberately excluded from the literature review. Deliberately means here that in hindsight, obviously, once the data point to the trumpet as being something important, what you would be doing is you would go to the literature and consult what is known about the trumpet. Now, that does, however, not mean that you necessarily would include a chapter about the trumpet in the literature review. You might decide to, but you might knowingly say, no, that's outside of the boundaries of my research. And therefore, the trumpet only comes in at the point of 4.4. And from there on is an integral part of my thesis and the discussion and the narrative flow. However, it is excluded from the literature review. It might, on the other hand, also be that you just would have forgotten about the trumpet. Now, if you, however, use this type of work and mirror the different components of your thesis front and backboard, it will allow you to detect such inconsistencies. And what you also can be seeing here is that the trumpet is also not mentioned within the methods. Now, research builds over related studies. Therefore, you might have picked up something from trumpets and related research about that, and also included it in the methods. Now, if it's only part from the findings onwards, it's logical that it's also not a part of the methods, because you haven't covered the related studies about trumpets in the literature review, and therefore, consequently, it is also not mirrored into the methodology chapter, if that makes sense to that point. Anyone still with me? Good. Now, what are the benefits of mirroring? Now, first of all, they can be a key to reduce the time. The time to the initial problem understanding, the time to results, the time to identify key literature, the time to the methodology crafting. As shown in this example, you pick up on the notes in 2.3, and from the theoretical perspective in the methodology 3.3, you again pick up some methodological parts related to the notes and build that in there. So this is a very structured way. And it also helps you to write up the thesis, because you immediately can see, okay, what is in which chapter and how do the different chapters relate to each other. And ultimately, it can help you to reduce time wasted, because you have a clear understanding using this image that the trumpet is missing, and you can say, yeah, that was a deliberate decision because trumpets only came out strongly once I collected the data. And meanwhile, I was looking into the literature, I found actually that this shouldn't be covered in the literature review, but that literature that relates to trumpets is used in chapter 5.4 once it comes to the analysis and discussion. Now, before we come into the next parts, are there any questions to this point?
There's nothing in chat.
There's nothing in chat, right? Then let's look into how mirroring is a gradual process. And in the next 18 slides, we will work through the timeline of the Thesis research project of our Anna, who's today not with us here, which is a research I happen to follow very closely since Anna is my wife. So I had the chance to, in hindsight, go back and see how has that research progressed over time. So I am presenting here a number of snippets from the research. This is one where the research was approximately 2.5 years going on. And as you can see on the left and the right side, you still have very generic titles. The title 1 says introduction, 1.1 says objectives of this work, 1.2 talks about research questions. So this is very generic. Likewise, on 4, you still have a question mark. What is this about? On 5, you have just a generic name, methodology. And at 6, you have focus group research. Now, this thesis has not the typical structure as we have seen before, 1 to 6. This thesis had, as a matter of fact, 3 literature review chapters and 3 data and finding chapters. And we will see how that comes together, because at this point, it was still not there. At this point, you have 2 literature review chapters, which are already working over very specific title. Chapter 2, which is about consumption patterns and energy consumption, consuming behaviors, and chapter 3, which is about promoting behavioral change as a road to sustainable development. And within chapter 2 and 3, you will see very specific titles. So there's no generics in there. Now, this is an initial structure on
Can I ask
how.
a question?
Yes, please.
Sorry. I've got and it may be, you may need to flick back 2 slides. It's reference of 1.1.2 is not covered in 2 and 3. Does it mean that it's not necessary to conduct a literature review on all points in the introduction?
All right. So 1.1.2 is
1.1.2 is not covered in 2 or 3, in chapter 2 or 3. Does it mean that it's not necessary to conduct literature review on all points in the introduction?
The word necessary here is a bit tricky. You are expected to cover these things to a certain extent. Let me put it like that. So you might well have been ending up to cover 1.1.2 within 2.3 introduction more generically, because it might have been that initially it didn't turn out to be a strong research issue or problem domain, and therefore you covered it at a lighter level. But the question that you put forward is a good one, because it shows that even at that level, you immediately will be triggered to ask yourself and control yourself, why is 1.1.2 not a dedicated area in the literature review? So this, I think, is a key learning to be taken out here. And then the decision to be taken, whether it should have a section 2.4, so to be equivalent strong to 1.1.1, that is a decision you can take at that point in time, if that makes sense. Good, but that's a good question.
Got it.
So let's look into this. Now this diagram shows how the research is envisioned. Now it's a very basic and initial diagram, but that also gives you the outline on how simple you might want to start. Don't have it overblown. And you can see that there are a number of activities foreseen in the research, which start from an initial literature review, from a questionnaire, focus group questionnaire, focus group interviews, followed by in-depth interviews, and then results. Now, this is still very generic presented. Now, if you look a bit further into the research, then you will see that it becomes more specific, what has been done. The focus gets sharper, and you get a clearer understanding that this research is about behavior, about change, about motivation, about barriers, about interventions, and about factors. So you have some building blocks on the different elements that the research is covering, and also where they are located. Are they internal and micro dimensions, or are they external and macro dimensions? Now, and you get that on the upper side mirrored with the lower side, where you look into the process view of the research. Still, it's a comparatively simple diagram to outline your research. Now, this simple diagram, now this is a third evolution of the very initial diagram. Let us go back, how it looked, how it evolved, and how it ultimately emerges into something more visualizing how the research has been building up. Now you see on the left-hand side the initial work, and on the right-hand side how the work then has been executed. So the left-hand side constitutes the literature review and the preparatory work on how the methodology has been brought together. And the right side then shows how the research has been executed and how the findings have been coming together. But you still see a lot of question marks below, and there are generics still remaining. Now, let us look how this research then emerged further. As said, there have been 3 literature review chapters and 3 data and finding chapters with analytics. And if you look into the below, you will see 2 and 6, whereby 2 is literature chapter with the corresponding data and finding and analysis chapter 6. And then you see the same for 3 and 7 and 4 and 8. Now, in this example, you see that color codes have been used so to see how the discussion informs each other across the chapters. And you will see a lot of white spots still and things that are not adding up. For example, for 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, there are less equivalents on the right side, but also for 3.8. So this is still not adding up consistently. And likewise, let us look into this now. This is a clear disproportion, and there is some mismatch. Now, if you have in 2.1 a literature review part, which talks about domestic energy use, but on the other side, you have in the data chapter a 6.1.1 till 6.1.5 that looks into different dimensions of the data. And the same goes for 2.2 to 6.2, then you still, or then you clearly can see that 2.2 has a much better literature framing and therefore allows much better in 6.2 to draw on the literature than is the case for 2.1. So understanding that allows you to go back to the literature and to see if for 6.1.1, 6.1.2, 6.1.3, 6.1.4, 6.1.5, there are still literature fields to be covered. Likewise, if you look into the left side, you see there 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6. Apparently, this literature is not doing anything afterwards in the data and finding. It's not used for any analytics in there. The question then is, why is it there? Now, if you see 2.3, the European context, okay, it provides context information. So that means the data still might, as a literature, still might be of use because it provides you with an overview, with a contextual view of the research area. So it can be therefore a deliberate decision to say, okay, I do keep 2.3 in the literature review, even if afterwards in the data and analysis, it is not used any longer. Now, we are still 5 years in the journey, and you also see now there are some notes. Exactly, we talked about 2.3. This is required to establish the differences between the European Union and Portugal in terms on how energy is used. So there was still a reason for keeping that. And likewise in the below, you see this is a part that might still needs to be reduced since it's mainly setting the scene. So these are notes that the researcher herself was taking, so to later on have a discussion base with a supervisor on what should stay in the thesis and what might need to go out and for which reason. And if I now say supervisors, it can be equally useful if you just discuss with your peers, because if you use this type of presenting your data, anyone can easier relate to that. And you can see here also that some things might still need to be moved, where you see this part is actually at chapter 1. So it's covered, and that comes back to exactly what Wei Leong just said with 112. It's not in the literature review, but it's in the introduction. So this is exactly the discussion that the researcher here had with herself and with the supervisor on discussing what should be in which parts of the thesis and what are the reasons for presenting it. And let's look a bit further into this. Now, this is again a quite obvious disproportion. You see that the literature review chapter 4 on behavioral change theory is having little matches actually with the data and finding and analytics that are presented in chapter 8. So there's something significant wrong, or at least some significant mismatch, and therefore you need to see and evaluate whether you have covered perhaps initially the wrong literature, or if the findings are just so surprising and point to a very different dimension, or what's also often is happening if the titles are just wrong and not representing the content of the sections. Now, this is actually a phenomenon that you will see in many theses, that what stands in the title is not what stands in the sections. So, and we will see that in the fourth part of this webinar, how the title and section content can also be mirrored. Now, this is half a year further in the journey, and you see that things are getting systematically addressed, that now you see 432 is being matched with 8.6 and 8.7. So gradually the chapters are aligned, and it is assured that all ends are covered, or that there is a clear reason for why some things are in chapter 4 perhaps, but not in chapter 8, and vice versa. And now this is a holistic picture of that Excel file, and you can use very simple tools here. There's no sophisticated software required. A simple Excel sheet will do good. And you see here where there is an old structure and a new structure compared. Now at the very left, you will see CT suggested new structure. CT was one of the 3 supervisors of the student. And so after discussing with the supervisor, the new structure has been settled on, and then it has been mirrored further to see how the new structure then would require changes in the remaining part of the thesis. Now, this is a very structured way of work, and it provides a very good overview on how the thesis is developing. So exactly, this is a part that then has been discussed with the supervisor, and how this then relates to the new structure presented on the left side. And if we zoom into this, then you see here the new and the old structure compared. And you will see the changes are actually not that strong. It's already very minor of what is moved and reduced. Now you had on the right side still 231, which was a white spot, literally speaking, that wasn't used. So that has been removed. And likewise, some other parts have been moved around. And after adopting this new structure, then you check what does it imply for the further structure of the thesis. Now in the above green spotted, you have chapter 1, the introduction, and chapter 9, the conclusion. And at this later time in the thesis journey, you then start to mirror out the relation in between the introduction and the conclusion chapter, so to assure that there is also from that end a consistent flow. So what has been introduced in 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 is also picked up in the conclusion, so it's not forgotten, but all of the parts are addressed consistently through the thesis. Now, this is another revision showing how the current chapter 9 conclusion then is suggested as a new and revised structure in accordance to match to the introductory part here shown on the left side. So this is, as you can see, a very, very gradual process. And as a matter of fact, this was sort of daily work. So whenever the research came on the table, then this Excel sheet was opened, and any changes through the thesis or through the research or any analytics in the data sets immediately were translated into the table, so that at any point in time that was updated and provided a holistic overview about where the research is and how it emerges. And ultimately, that allows you to map out that there is a narrative right from the introduction up to the conclusion. And once you are there at that level, we see now the same image that before still had some question marks and blank spots. At the end of the thesis, it then was clear how the different parts are matching. So you have now very specific titles on the below part for the chapters 2, 3, and 4 on the literature review, and how they translate to the data findings and analytics chapters 6, 7, and 8. And exactly in the circle, you will see the different data collection techniques and where they have been coming in, so to support the research. Now, this is a level of detail that can be expected towards the end of the research if you worked with specific titles and if you gradually mirror things out. And this is the evidence of the final of the thesis. It's a table that shows at a glance what is where in the thesis addressed, and it just from the table allows you to clearly understand what was the research about. Now, this is really at the end of the published thesis. So if you hit this level of detail, then I think the Viva examination will be a very smooth going experience, because the examiners will clearly understand your work and what has been done and where in the thesis to find which type of information. Now, are there any questions on this gradual process walking through?
There's nothing sitting in chat.
Nothing.
Anybody wish to ask a question?
Good. So since this was a bit heavy on the example side, let's now move a bit more in the theoretical end and come in with some fresh music. And I see something comes in. I have a question. Is there a difference?
So you've got, thank you for your presentation. I have one question. Is there a difference between organizing the thesis in chapters and subchapters and organizing it in sections and subsections? To me, the chapters and sections do the same thing, but I organize my thesis in sections and subsections. And I've been told by the scientific committee that I need to reorganize it into chapters instead. I personally don't see how that could improve the actual content and the scientific contribution to this thesis could bring.
Good. Well, let me put it in that way. There are a lot of preferences in politics and research, and there are a lot of strong views and opinions too. And I think it's very difficult to argue on that level. And in particular, if you're a doctoral research student, it might not be a wise thing to do. Now, what perhaps would be the wisest is to understand the motivations for that request first, and to then, once you understand the motivations and grasp the logic behind, to compare it to the structure you have been adopting. And if you then compare both ends, you can either do as you have been asked to, or you can go back and seek a discussion and clarification without objecting. That is. Or as a third way, which is a perhaps more risky one, you find some related studies that exactly worked over the same angles as you did, and say, look, and then you go back to the ones with whom you discussed earlier and say, look, the reason for me adopting this structure is because I've seen in this work that was coming together nicely. And based upon that, you then might get agreement from the other side to continue that way, or you get the reasons for why you still should be changing. I think this type of feedback seeking approach forward might be best geared to put you on the safe side, if that makes any sense. Good. So let us look into this. And let me say that I'm not very much gifted with music. So this wasn't me coming up with this, but one of our students at one of the residencies, once we talked about mirroring, he said, yeah, Andreas, I know what you talk about. I love opera and I see it there all of the time. And so then we looked into, or he put on some slides looking into music and opera and showing us how the very same technique of mirroring is used to build up operas and music. So if you look here at the first 5 bars and the last 5 bars, you will see some mirroring taking place. Now, I can't go to a deeper level of detail because I lack that musical understanding. What I can tell, however, is that not only in music it is used, but also in other parts. And if we look here into the patterns of intuition, we still are in the music, but we talk about light of algorithmic composition. So that has a different level of complexity. And it also talks about the mirroring technique, which in my German mother tongue is referred to as Spiegeltechnik, and how this has been used already very thoroughly in the past. And it has been used by musicians such as Johann Sebastian Bach or Anton Weber. So it's something that dates quite a while back. And it can help you, if you look into that and understand a bit about it, to see the analogies on how you can apply that across domains, that being mirroring, and how you can make it you work for your own research. Now, those are some example literature sources if you want to see other domains where mirroring has been used. And even in the work of Tchaikovsky and the limit of traditional diatonic thought, you can see how mirroring has been used as a mean to work out parallels and antithesis. So there's a lot of information in there if you want to go a bit more into the theoretical framing of mirroring, in the case you would want to use that as a more conceptual framework of your work, then be welcome to look into that. And if you say, well, I won't go through with music at my faculty, then look into other sources where it equally has been used, like here you see working knowledge, business research for business leaders. And there it also has been used as a mean to easier cope with complexity, to show reciprocally interdependent task within a common organizational group, and to have decomposed it into parsimoniously linked sub-problems. So it can be, mirroring can be used in a number of ways, and it allows you to reduce complexity, and even in business studies, but not only limited to business studies. It also can be then come in with helping you to isolate informations and to see how different modules exist next to each other and how they work together. So, and in this case, it has this mapping allows the mirroring hypothesis to be formally stated in terms of a structural correspondence between two networks. So it's sort of network analysis, also one technical and one organizational. Now, this is very thorough scientific work that shows how mirroring in practice has been used. And now it allows you to detect patterns and to identify relations, be it like here's the one at the left or the music example on the right. So, and it's, as we've seen from the Thesis example before, it's a powerful way and means to visualize your research. The mirror is one of the most copied metaphors in the Western thought. In ancient Greek mythology, Narcissus dies transfixed on his reflection in a spring. According to early sociology, we are looking glass self. Our identities are formed when we mirror how we think others see us. Now, so this is very long going backward, and it's a mean to support scientific inquiry. So there's a lot in there. And reflecting, repeating, amplifying, translating, replicating, and copying are core modes for understanding the control of modern information. So again, there are multiple purposes that mirroring can come into. So to support your data computation and to visualize it. So take a look if you want to learn a bit more about the theory of mirroring in those different sources. This one here is from Princeton University Press. So it comes from a number of different fields on how mirroring can be used and has been used historically. Are there any further questions on that theoretical end before we come again to the practical side in the fourth and final part of this webinar and look into examples of mirroring within the thesis?
There's nothing in the chat. If anybody wishes to ask directly.
So I got away with my lack of theoretical framing of mirroring. That's great.
Looks that way, eh? Well
yes, done. Yes, I already admitted that my music skills are arguable. Okay, so let's go back to practice. Mirroring in the table of content. Now it's the same thesis that we've been looking into before. And this is a high-level overview on how the thesis belongs to each other. Now there are still some white spots, as you can see, but that were settled on to stay for various reasons, either because there was no purpose of mirroring, or there were open introductions and dead ends. But you see over and above, the thesis adds up well at the first and second level healing. And this is the final outcome as you might wish to have it for your own work. And if I say you might want to wish having it, that doesn't mean you need to have it in your thesis. It's perfectly fine if you only have it for you as a control tool and working tool. Now, in the thesis, we see, for example, Anna in her thesis had this chapter summaries, which were very high regarded by her examiners, but also in her faculty. It was seen as an excellent level of detail. Now, I've been working with quite some 100 students since, and recently I had a student that exactly had the same tables for his very different work, because the student got inspired by the work of Anna. Now, in that case, because of what I would call internal politics in that faculty, it was rejected. The external examiner in the Viva found it quite informative. The internal examiner didn't like it because they liked a more fluffy approach to science and research that rather talks about your feeling and how great the day is, instead of working over perhaps this level of detail, and therefore the student was asked to remove it. Now, you see the same approach can be regarded or rejected depending on the politics. And coming back to the question that Daniela earlier had, should I just do as I was asked for? Well, you might, but first of all, get clarity. What is the reason for that? Is it because you yourself have done a not so good job? Then obviously you would want to understand that and learn from that. Or is it just you did something differently and the preference or the politics in the faculty would ask for something to be done in a different way? Then so be it. And you just do it as you have been asked for. I think understanding is a good point before you then take action. Now, initially, I already mentioned that what's at the title perhaps is not what is in the section. And this often is a great risk. Once students give me a draft to read, it very often happens that what they put in the title is nothing about what they discuss. And it's so obvious because you just need to use the search form of whatever text editor you use, and to search for the words that you have in the title and see how often do they show up in the text. And often they show not up at all, or only once or twice. And then it's clear this is not a focused discussion. Now, if we do this here, in 7.1, the keywords are motivational variables in energy efficient behavior. So motivations and behaviors should set the narrative in the discussion. And if we look through the sections and subsections, they indeed do what the title says. And they do that because it was mirrored out. So it was assured that the title says what the section is talking about, and vice versa. Now, you also see here in blue highlighted a reflective discourse and how this is derived from exactly the key terms. And having a clear understanding about your key terms, as much as having a table that mirrors out the different parts of the thesis, those are two very useful tools. Now, the first one was the table that we looked at how the headings are mirrored across the thesis, but also having a list of key terms and how they relate to each other can help you to understand how your thesis is building up and coming together. And here we again see how the dialogue has been kept consistent. So we talk about social norms in 625, and then we go back and we go further into 713. So those are two data and analysis chapters, and we see that what was introduced in chapter 6 on the social norms, 625 here more precisely, is followed up in 713, where we still talk about social norms and put it together with other key terms into a consistent dialogue. Now, admittedly, this takes time and efforts, this level of work, but it's time well invested, I would argue. Now, another example here from on the left side, 341, literature review, which talks about habits as a barrier, and 731, which is a data and analysis where we see habits as an obstacle to the adoption of a more energy efficient behavior. So the initial two terms, habits and barrier, are in parts reused in the data and analysis. We still talk about barriers, but more precisely, we talk about obstacles to the adoption of more energy efficient behavior as being one barrier. So while in 341, the level of discussion was much more broad and not that specific, habits as a barrier as such, in 731, based upon the data, we can define which type of barriers we are seeing there. And one of the barriers that could be observed from the data that had been collected were the obstacles to the adoption of more energy efficient behavior. And the details about that are covered in 731, where, for example, the one quote says, "It's really a habit. I enter a room and I switch the light on. I could go back and switch the one before off, but I don't, and I go further on like this." Now, and if I would read that at one of my sons would be in this room, he would say, "Papa, they talk about you." Because every time Papa leaves the bathroom, Papa leaves the light on because Papa thinks, I still need to go back in a minute or two. And my son thinks there's no reason for the time being to keep the light on because Mama has taught him that that's not a good thing to do. So the research of Anna actually paid off in practice, at least for our household, because we save energy on that end due to the habits of our kids. So if you want some further training on how to mirror out your thesis research, we have this advanced training course on writing up and structuring your thesis. Now, it was framed for students that are already in the data collection process, so at a later point in time, but it might provide you with some useful hints and examples, also if you're at an earlier point in your research, at least to take a look at it. It's available for free self-study with peer support, fully tutored, or with flexible on-demand feedback whenever you need it. And as we come to the end of the webinar, we will now stop the recording. and open the floor for discussion.